just going to try and blast through several different sort of theories that get used in social science to address some of the kinds of problems that you talk about. A zillion people at this conference have been talking about education and how that works in general, or they're actually just sort of saying it as a panacea. Some of the theories in social science help you understand what's actually going on in a persuasion context when you're trying to get somebody to do something different. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about norms and attitudes and persuasion theory, and something called the diffusion of innovations. This kind of comes out of communications and geography, how ideas spread across space and time. So all of those things have some things to teach us when we're trying to get people to do things. Sort of the basis of almost all of this stuff is the idea that people think before they act. Not always true, but it's the concept behind that is that some sort of cognitive process is going on when people decide what they like and don't like and what they're going to do and not do. And we've organized these different concepts and talk about them, and just like any other science, lots of people talk past each other and use lots of different terms. And so you may have heard some of these terms and you may use them right, and you may use them wrong from different perspectives. But anyway, we're just going to try and blast through a few of these. The basic idea is that you have a few fundamental, stable values, the way you think the world works, your worldview, that kind of stuff. Those lead to some basic beliefs, and when it comes to things like the environment, you have some basic ideas about whether you should be protecting it or whether the environment is there for your use. It's kind of the two polar scales, a use protection scale, and you're either on one end or the other or somewhere in the middle. Those lead to some more general attitudes towards things in nature, how you feel about endangered species or a specific species or whatnot. And that filters down to attitudes are evaluations, positive or negative, towards some object. And then you have more specific attitudes towards even more specific things, that specific animal that you see or some practice that you do in the environment. And those are all based on ideas of, they all come in some sort of ordered hierarchical way. That's the concept here. And that those eventually inform your intentions to behave, and sometimes you even actually do what you think you're intending to do. But all of those things have to work for somebody to actually do something. And basically one of the main things that hierarchy does is convince you to stop worrying about the values, which you can't change and that are fundamental to people and are very difficult to change, and they're very stable in people, and work hard on the things that are at the action end of the hierarchy. Work on their specific attitudes and their specific norms, and then they might do something different. And you try to change those. There's lots of different flavors of how norms work. We once read a paper about that. And there's too many definitions to deal with, but we're going to talk with about maybe 2 or 3 that might be relevant for you. But the idea of norms is there's 2 basic kinds. There's a descriptive norm, which describes regularities in people's behaviors. So, that's the norm. That's how people act. So that's the kind of descriptive version. And then there's an injunctive version, which is what we want people to do. There should behaviors, the obligation behaviors. So sometimes people do something different than what they should be doing. Either one of those are things that we might want to encourage. And it's good to distinguish those two. Sometimes a norm is internal to the person. It's something they think. If it's internalized, you would feel guilty if you didn't do it, for instance. So it's kind of internalized to yourself. And then there's other times of norms where you're trying to put outside social pressure on somebody to do something. And both of those can have effects on people. And Wade's going to talk more about that kind of social norm, also called a subjective norm at times. As I talked about before, they link to all your other stuff. It's all a big mush. And dealing with it is important. But I think the main point about all of the attitude and norm research is that you're trying to figure out when does an attitude or a norm, when is it strong and actually likely to affect somebody's behavior, and when is it weak or emerging and not quite there. And when we're trying to get people to do new things, it's because it's an emerging norm that we're trying to promote or get people to buy into. And they might not have that figured out yet. And we can measure norms and attitudes and things like that through survey research mostly, and figure out how far along people are, and that may help us figure out how to convince them to go further, for example. One theory, a series of littering experiments from a guy named Cialdini, talks about norm focus theory. And his point is that norms only work when they're in focus. They're only in focus. He's the one that came up with essentially that difference between descriptive and injunctive norms. The the situational cues are the things that make those norms pop out for people. So if there's lots of litter lying around, you're more likely to litter. If people are screaming at you, stop littering, you're less likely to litter. It seems common knowledge, but it's pretty interesting to see how he's experimented with that. His biggest point is that descriptive norms, what's out there, are really underappreciated for how powerful they are. And the classic example there is, well, I think I'll get to it at the end of this thing, but his point is to focus them all, and particularly that descriptive norm. Sometimes we don't in our literature. How many of you are from the 70s and remember Iron Eyes Cody, the Indian that cried at the end of the thing? A little less than I thought. Anyway, this is a famous ad in the 70s with an Indian that canoes down a river that's polluted and then gets litter thrown at him on a highway and starts crying at the end of it. And it's a very powerful commercial, but Cialdini would say that it wasn't good enough because it showed all that litter. It gave a mixed message that littering was okay, and has proven in experiments that that is less powerful than if he had made it a pristine environment that had one littering incident. Similar theory from Schwartz called the norm activation theory. This one is, it's very similar. It's the idea of a personal moral norm that's internalized to yourself that will make you do something. And you got to get that activated. And the way you do that is two different things here. You increase the awareness of the consequences of the action. So that's the AC. And in a classic case of trying to get people to stop causing forest fires, you start explaining how devastating it could be for the local forest or the town that lives nearby. And then the other thing you have to do is get people to convince themselves that they're part of the problem. It's a factually not true case that it's only you that can prevent forest fires. It's everybody, or else there's a forest fire. So everybody has to be done. It's not just one person, but you got to convince people that they're really the problem. And so if you're thinking about what you're trying to do in education programs, you're trying to ramp up AC or AR. And that's almost always what you're trying to do when it comes down to it. And you should think about which one of those you got more active these days and probably do some more on the other side, because they both seem to be important. So that activates the norm, and then people start doing stuff. It's been done, and it's been shown in many different pro-environmental behaviors, recycling and yard burning, and I don't know, lots of different contexts that you got to ramp both of those up to get people to behave right. One application of that fits for this conference is the study on Lake Powell. This is so people on Colorado River just above Grand Canyon, big old lake. People in pleasure craft, motorized craft mostly, but sometimes sea kayaks and things like that. And you're not supposed to dump in the lake, right? Obviously, your human waste in the lake. So they asked people they figured out, did people know about the consequences of dumping in the lake? Did they ascribe responsibility to themselves, and then did they do it? Or were they committed to not doing it? And they found that all those things, surprisingly, they were asking people directly, did you dump in the lake? Even though there's lots of literature out there that said that's illegal. And about 20% said they were actually doing that kind of activity. So you can even that even more were doing that, because there were some that were smart enough not to admit it. But it just goes to show that there's a lot of resistance out there, even when laws are known, but people are sort of not very strategic about answering those kinds of questions. And they found that although a lot of people had the appropriate gear, toilets on their boats and things like that, a lot of them would try to use the restrooms that were provided. So if you have a mixed system where you have restrooms and you want people to carry out, they're still going to try and use your restrooms more often. So you just got to be aware of how that tends to work. And then they showed that AC and AR both matter, and they were able to show that for the whole model, they could explain about 76% of the variance in whether people would dump or not dump by what they knew about consequences and what they thought about their own responsibility. So it's a powerful program. Some quick ideas from persuasion theory, a very complex topic, and a lot of people spend a lot of time on it. One sort of point there that I think is good. A lot of us want to change everybody's attitude first, or their norms, and figure that will change their behavior. Sometimes, really, I don't care about changing their attitude. I don't necessarily need to change their attitude. I just want to change their behavior. So there may be times when you just make them do stuff, right? So that's what laws are about. You make people carry out their ways. You make them show you their system or whatnot, and then they'll actually build the attitudes underneath it after they've had to buy the system, after you've made them change their behavior. They may not even agree with it, but they have to go along with it because they don't want to pay the fine. And sometimes attitudes follow behavior rather than the other way around. It's not always as clean as people think. It's Cialdini again, a great researcher, by the way. A great book you should buy is called Influence, that he wrote back in 2001. It'll probably change your life, or at least make you less susceptible to getting persuaded by marketers on what they'd use to convince you to buy stuff. But some of the principles that he talks about to get people to do stuff for you, even if you can't change their attitudes. One of them is the reciprocity theory, which is if you give something trivial to somebody, they feel that they have to sort of give back, and sometimes they'll give back in a bigger way, or not sometimes, most of the time. And the classic example there is the lemonade stand, where you offer it for free and then ask for a donation. You'll make way more money than if you charged for it. And it's just a fact. And so that kind of thing works, and that's a little bit of what you're doing in those early stages of giving out free wag bags and things of that nature. I think you're getting people to buy in with a pretty trivial cost. This idea that people are consistent, once you get them to commit a little bit, they have a hard time going back on their own word. So getting that initial commitment is really important. We've certainly talked about social proof ideas, that if you have your rangers modeling it and your outfitters modeling it and things like that, it shows that people are doing this kind of thing and that it's doable, and that has a pretty big effect on people. The people that are sending the message have to be likable and like the people that are doing the activity. So having rangers like Jesse, who is a climber himself, is so critical for getting the message across. They can trust a guy like him. They're not going to trust the park superintendent or the chief ranger if they're not a climber, for instance, that kind of thing. And I know that he's pretty active on message boards and things like that, and that's why that works. And then finally, remember that most people are sheep. They will follow authority. So having a rule and a regulation can have a big effect on a bunch of people who might otherwise not agree with you, but will still do it anyway. And that's a good thing. Some other quick persuasion ideas. Old men are the hardest to convince to change, and young people and women are easiest. It's, again, just a fact. I'm not trying to be biased towards or for anybody, but if you have some options of teaching women and children, you will have more success in all likelihood. You got to do it through multiple channels and multiple sources, and those are communication ideas. All this social networking stuff that the internet's about is going to provide a bunch of new opportunities, and if you're not using those, you're going to miss this group. Trailhead's probably too late. This idea that some people are ignorant and don't know what to do, they need a different message than somebody who is anti what you're asking them to do. Who is volitionally opposed to doing this kind of thing. So you might have to work that around. And it's always good to try and use emotional and humor. We've seen that over the last couple of days, that some of those messages resonate better sometimes and teach people more. How much time? 1 minute left? Can I have that? Oh, okay. The last idea I want to talk about is this concept of the diffusion of innovations. This comes from Everett Rogers back in the 60s. This idea of how ideas spread across time and space. And I think the main idea here that I think this room really needs to remember is that good technologies don't always sell themselves. There's more to it than that. You're missing a big piece if you've only worked out the engineering ideas. You've got to sell people on this stuff. Two examples, classic examples from that literature. Scurvy, a terrible disease that afflicted people on ships back in the 1800s or 1600s, 1700s and whatnot. They knew the answer to fix that was citrus fruit 60 years before they implemented it in the merchant marine of the British merchant marine. And so it's not always true that just because you know the answer that people will actually do anything about it, even for a horrible, awful disease that we know the answer for. And it's true even today. We've got, most of us use typewriters that have a keyboard on it that was designed for, or we use a keyboard for our computers that was designed for a typewriter that they purposely made the keys in bad places to slow it down so they wouldn't jam. And that's a fact. And so but we still use that. And it's never taken off, even though we have other keyboards that everybody has proven could be faster and be less hard on your wrists and whatnot. But hardly any of us have changed to that new keyboard. So even good ideas, 50 years later, they just may not have been adopted. So how does that, the diffusion theory has some things about, there's different stages of diffusion where people are making decisions in different ways, and they need different kinds of information at those times. So they get their first exposure during a knowledge stage. They do an active search when they're sort of deciding what kind of system to have or whatnot. They make a decision when they compare things, and they usually compare very few things rather than, you think that we're all smart and we're going to compare all the systems, but most people in the world are going to juggle one or two, not make a very multivariate decision. So you got to realize that and tailor things accordingly. Then they try it and they still may reject it, and there may be small things that cause them to reject it. One bad experience with a certain kind of can or a certain bag, and they may never go back to that. So you got to know how that kind of affects human beings, because they don't make rational decisions all the time. But you're trying to get to that final stage of confirmation where they stick with it. This is another concept that comes from that theory, this idea that there are innovators, that's the folks in this room and some of the people that have invented systems, and the early adopters. So we're all in that category. And the big jump that you need to make is from that to the early majority that starts using these systems. Arguably, rivers have gone to the early and even late majority at this point, and maybe a few of those mountains have. But the rest of you are still struggling with, you're still on this side of the chasm, and you haven't quite got everybody to buy in yet, and on carry-out in particular. So you got some work to do there, but it's important to realize who you're trying to reach, because each of those populations is probably different in how you approach them and what you try to work for them. The characteristics of success when it comes to diffusion, you obviously need your new technology to have a big enough comparative advantage that it overwhelms the inertia of sticking with the old. That has to fit with the way people live, and that's one of those things that we have the hardest time with this poop issues, because people learn this at a really early age and they're pretty stuck on how they do it. The simpler, the easier it is to adopt. This idea of observability, that's almost identical to the social proof idea from persuasion research, which is that you got to keep up with your neighbors. And so if your neighbors are using it and you can show your neighbors using it, people are much more likely to buy into it. So that's really important to show that everybody else is using it. So anyway, there's some convergence among all these theories of different ways of looking at how people behave. My final example is just a river up in Alaska where they don't have, there's no formal carry-out program yet, but they want to get there. And they're doing some of the same things we heard from the climbing folks. They're giving away bags. They're showing different systems to the river users. They're renting them out at the put-in to try and get those early adopters and innovators on board and getting them committed. They've sent down a group of people to test different systems and report out and that sort of thing. So they're doing an active sort of attention-seeking period. And that's the right thing to do at this stage. And then later they're going to move into, you have to have them. But it's not coming right away. I think that's it for sort of an overview of some of the ideas there. But social science has a lot to offer on tailoring your message, and it's not just mom and apple pie that's going to work. You're going to have to be more focused and to work, and you have to think hard about who's your laggards, who's slow to resist, or who's resisting at the moment, and how you're going to reach them.
I'm here before you today, having spent the past 10 or so years working in a variety of education, resource management capacities, and as a graduate student. And a lot of those experiences have kind of coalesced to addressing these leave no trace and environmental ethics concepts. And so the research I'm going to present to you today was born from my dissertation. The danger in that is that I took quite a deep dive into the dissertation. And so for the audience here today, I need to move from where Doug was at kind of 30,000 feet, which is a comfortable place, down almost like in a little crop duster and kind of go over top of the weeds and then emerge on the other side, hopefully without horrifying anybody along the way. So I think the interface of where you all are at, or the most of you, and the world that Doug and I occupy is important. And I have felt over the past 2 days much like I'm attending a science fair with a bunch of really innovative engineers who are experimenting with some new and emerging technologies. And so taking those to the public and making the sale is really where I think we come into play. And I think, like he left with, there's a lot we can learn from social science research and what it takes to persuade people to buy in. And so much like leading a horse to water, we can yank as much as we want on that rope, but if we took a step back and applied some social science theory to the question, we might find that the horse just wants some beer, and all we got to do is give him what he wants, and we'll have adoption of whatever the behavior or practice is that we're looking for. So this is the end of the pictures. You're about to go into dissertation land here for a moment. Am I a little too far away? So yes, not a lot of colorful pictures from here, but hopefully some rather interesting information. The project itself was a rather large study. We visited 3 National Park Service units: Glacier National Park in northwest Montana, Olympic National Park in western Washington on the Olympic Peninsula, and Cumberland Island National Seashore, just north of Jacksonville, Florida. The purpose itself was broad, with the original funding agent, which was the Wilderness Program, in 2006. They really just wanted to begin to develop a model for assessing where Leave No Trace is at, and to begin to develop a baseline so that we can begin to move forward some of our education efforts. And so from that very broad charge that we were given by the then program manager at the time, we began to kind of dismantle the project and begin to overlay social science theory with Leave No Trace as it currently exists and is promoted in the national parks. So for today's presentation, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the theory that we used. I think it's, when you hear it, you're going to see that there are probably pieces that you're already using, and perhaps some pieces of it that you can highlight to help you move a little further down the road and in the direction that you desire. It will end with the drivers or determinants of behavior. It's been alluded to all along over the past 2 days, but from the Olympic and the glacier samples that I'll speak to today, really what seems to be driving intentions in both of those units. And then finally, some suggestions that I would have if you find yourself with similar situations to the ones that we cover today. I first want to basically shoot holes in the myth that simply by modifying someone's knowledge, you can in fact modify or influence their behavior. And in particularly in the environmental realm, folks, that really doesn't hold a lot of water. And you can preach till you're blue in the face about yes or no dichotomous outcomes. You should do this or you shouldn't do that. You may get a very short-term outcome that you're looking for. You may turn off people to that, but it's really not working. And there's a gentleman at the University of Idaho named Sam Ham who calls this the learning leads to loving hypothesis. And there's a whole body of research that speaks to it. It's more than that, particularly in the environmental realm. And so instead, and Doug spoke to this a minute ago, we, from the social science world, think that it's really some type of combination of the underpinning of our values and how they come up to the surface through a combination of our beliefs and then specific attitudes about behaviors or practices that really move us to an ethics adoption and modification of the practices that we're engaged in. And we can talk more about that at the conclusion, but this linear or direct correlation between knowledge and behavior change, it really doesn't hold water when you begin to test it. The theory of planned behavior has been around for a number of years, around 20 at this point. It stems from an even earlier theory. And the basic tenets are this, that behavior is driven by intentions. Between one's intention to act and actually engaging in that act, you can be impacted by outside environmental factors. Now, notwithstanding those, it's likely that our intentions are driven by some combination of our attitudes towards the behavior in question, normative influence, subjective norms, which Doug spoke to, and then levels of control. And so what I believe about myself, kind of this concept of self-determination or efficacy with the ability to carry out that behavior in question. And so it is, in terms of the 30,000 foot level, a relatively easy theory to understand. It's typically the combination of these three factors: attitude towards specific behavior, the influence of the people around me, and in this case, let's say on a backpacking or a rock climbing trip or a river trip, and then finally the level of control that I feel that I have over that behavior. The challenge in applying social research using or through this lens of the theory of planned behavior is in how we measure these constructs, and that gets a little bit challenging, and where I'll dip down into the weeds, but just momentarily, I promise. Our two study sites, if you're not familiar with them, Glacier National Park is around 1 million acres, and Kyle can help me out with that, of de facto wilderness, and so it's close, but not quite the big W yet. Olympic National Park is slightly over 1 million acres of designated wilderness. As you'll see here in a moment, the types of visitors there are largely the same, and they are also, as I'll get to here with a graphic, really supportive of the concept of leave no trace, and so as the program is broadly defined, they are supportive of it. When they found I was a graduate student doing research, I didn't tell them it was about leave no trace specifically, it was just about their backcountry experience. You can see that at Glacier, over 99% of the people I talked to were willing to give me their name and address. We followed up with a questionnaire mailed to them a couple weeks later, and upwards of 70% at Glacier and almost 75 at Olympic responded. There were about 110 variables in the questionnaire, and Hawk is in the room. He actually completed one, and he can tell you it was not a small challenge to work your way through it. So, a very good response rate. I'll just point out a couple of things. And the gentleman from Yosemite made reference to this a little earlier. The people that are using our National Park Service backcountry and wilderness lands are primarily white males. They are also highly educated. They have a fairly high median income. They are much like you would think, and so in terms of diversity of users, it's not quite there yet. One difference I'll point out between the two samples. At Glacier, 3 out of 4, this was their first visit to the park. And as Kyle and I were talking about earlier, you really have to want to get to northwest Montana. If you compare that with Olympic National Park and its proximity to the Seattle metropolitan area, it's almost a weekend escape. And 2 hours out of Seattle, you can be at Port Angeles and up to the Wilderness Information Center, and then out to the coast or into the Intermountain region there. Years experience, there's a little bit of divergence here, a little bit of variability in the data. Less experienced at Glacier, and I think that will come out in the results as we get to those. Slightly more experienced at Olympic. And as far as trip characteristics, group size, miles traveled, quite similar. And then with a single item, perception is reality of where they thought they were in terms of their leave no trace knowledge, about average. And all of the scales, as I'll talk about here in a minute, were a 7-point scale. For Ben and my friends over at Leave No Trace, it is saturated at a global awareness or diffusion level. It is highly diffused, upwards of 94% or 98% in our two respective parks have heard of this program. And then when we look at it on this 7-point scale that I mentioned, so from strongly disagree, 1 to 7 strongly agree, and we ask the question, it's important to use minimum impact or leave no trace techniques when in the backcountry, you can see that we are off the charts. And actually, this is Cumberland data is laid on this graphic as well. So if you're looking on this, if you're into mean scores, that's well above a 6, probably approaching 6.5 with a very little small deviation. So there's not a lot of noise, not a lot of wiggle room in the data itself. However, as we move from these kind of global or holistic measures, and we begin to deconstruct this process or this program of leave no trace, and we begin to look at specific attitudes on various practices, you see that it doesn't hold water quite as well, and then there's a bit of a divergence. And so this is an item that we pulled out, one of many items that I'll use in the model here in a minute, but you can see on this item of bury and use toilet paper, and when they were asked about the appropriateness of that, you can see that on this side, there was somewhere between 10 to 18%, depending on the unit, that felt that was very inappropriate. Conversely, on the other side, when you ask about bury and use toilet paper, it's almost identical, that somewhere around 25% of the people that we sampled said, that's probably very appropriate in the environment X that I'm filling this out for. And then a rather wide, what we would describe as standard deviation between those. And so if you were looking at it in a traditional bell curve, it would be a mean of around 4 in the middle, and it would be widely dispersed. So again, and we had about 30 or so items, I believe, in the final model, and most of them were like this. And when you get into the specifics, there was apparently some confusion or not understanding. We used a rather complicated process that I don't want to spend too much time on, but I'm just going to hit the highlights of it. It's called structural equation modeling, and it allows you to address really complex relationships with a large number of what we term observed variables or indicators or questions, like the one I just showed on the board. By doing that, it allows you to increase validity, and so we move away from just simple single indicators per construct, these being constructs, norms, control, attitude, intentions. And it also allows us to remove error variance. And so if you think of descriptive statistics like mean scores, and then maybe a little further down the road are testing differences and doing means test, and then into like a ordinary least squares regression, as structural equation modeling would be way out there on the end. And this is kind of on the cutting edge in terms of quantitative psychology, and the advantages it gives us very firm footing in our conclusions that we base on this data. Again, some of the nuances of measurement with this process: you take a single item, we split it in half with the software program, and we begin to use these observed variables, these questions or indicators, to capture the constructs that are of interest to us. And so So for example, campfire attitude, right? It's one of the 7 leave no trace principles, arguably a core one considering the significant impacts that arise from campfires. And we use 4 items to capture it. So having a campfire, cooking over a campfire in the backcountry, building a fire ring if one is not present, and leaving charred wood in the fire ring. And each one of those is, again, scaled on that 7-point scale. And you can almost think of it as putting an umbrella over top of that concept. It allows us to capture what is unobservable, but we do it via these items. The next slide, it will be less than a minute. If big, complicated statistical diagrams scare you, close your eyes. If not, hang tight. It'll be over quickly. The final model ends up looking like this. We have our intentions as measured via 3 items: leave no trace attitudes, the influence of people around us, levels of control is split out by perceived control as well as perceived difficulty over that action, and finally our single indicator item of knowledge. There, it's gone, I told you. Where that arrives us at is an ability, once we have the nuances of the measurement worked out, which took a ridiculous amount of time in my cubicle at Clemson, to identify and look at these pathways of interest that are to us. And so again, what at the end of the day is driving intentions? Because if we know what is driving intentions, we can build education strategies or mitigation strategies, whatever the case may be, that are better informed by data. And so again, is it an attitude as reflected in these 3 core tenets of the leave no trace philosophy? Is it subjective norms, levels of control, as again is perceived control or perceived difficulty, or is it self-reports of knowledge, again on the philosophy that the perception is reality for most of us? And so for Glacier, it would seem that it seems to be a combination of 3 things. And this was an interesting finding to us. And as you look back, and as I think back, perhaps not all that surprising. Those folks from Glacier are maybe a first-time visitor to a national park. It's a destination park. While they do have a 10 or more year experience with backcountry travel, they're only doing 1 or 2 trips a year. And so they're not novices. They're not out there every weekend doing it. They're kind of somewhere in the middle of it. And it would seem to be a combination of the people around them, this normative component, how difficult the behaviors are for them to carry out, and then finally self-reports of leave no trace knowledge. And those seem to be the drivers. Doug talked about how much variance can be explained in a model, and this explains about 50%. And in social research, that's quite a high percent. It's higher than you find in most peer-reviewed papers. When we contrast that with our friends from Olympic National Park, the only thing that comes to the surface is this perception of difficulty. And so with all of those observed indicators and these constructs that we felt we did a fairly good job capturing, it boils down to how difficult is that behavior for me to carry out. And you know what? If it's not too difficult, it's likely that my intention to carry it out will be high. But if I perceive it as being difficult or onerous, it's likely that I'm not going to. And so just interesting when you look from the Glacier folks, who are relatively less experienced, to the Olympic folks, you start to see some differences in those findings. I'll hit on a couple things in summary here, and we can open it up for questions for the two of us if you like. For Ben and the folks here from Leave No Trace, you know, at some point we're preaching to the choir, but you can see that when we get into the individual attitudes, things fall apart. And so at a general level or a global level, people are not only aware of this program, but they are highly supportive of it. And that's a good thing. And so that means we can begin to focus our education efforts on conditions on the ground and begin to really address the problematic areas. And kind of on that same thread, I would say that simple awareness of these messages does not equate to practice of it. And that may seem simplistic, but there was widespread variability. We have a paper that will be published in November this year in the International Journal of Wilderness, that speaks to these various items, a wide number of items. And you'll see if you have a chance to look at the paper, there's a lot of variability in the practices. And finally, there are some very definite drivers of behavior that began to emerge. And as you could see, the Glacier was normative, it was perceived difficulty, and it was some knowledge. And the folks out at Olympic National Park, it's really how they perceive how difficult it is. They know what the right thing to do is. But if they think it's going to be too much to carry on, it's likely that you're not going to have compliance. And so then it becomes really on the shoulders of the park personnel to address it through a variety of persuasion techniques to show how it's within their realm to carry it out. So to make a suggestion is, particularly on that thread, is the ease of complying. Don't underestimate the affective, so the emotional component that is tied to these, particularly with handling of waste. And particularly on the Shy Beach area, where probably 30% or more of our sample came from Olympic, it's a huge issue out there. There's also, I think, something to be said for the normative component and encouraging groups to police their own. And if you think about it in a structure, almost like one of those shopping things where it's a pyramid structure, and so if you get someone at the top, they can get the rest of their group. I think there are lessons to be learned from this research from that, and so really targeting those trip leaders and the opinion leaders, kind of tying back into some of the diffusion theory. And finally, while knowledge doesn't necessarily equate in a linear fashion to behavior, there does have to be some initial education on the ground, kind of yes or no, and proper techniques, and then followed up by the why behind the what. I've get the opportunity in Washington. One of the hats I wear is to oversee the outdoor ethics program, which is Leave No Trace and Tread Lightly. And every now and again, I'll get to field a call or participate with a park, and I always ask them to start backwards. And so really, what are the conditions on the ground, and what are the problem behaviors that you see there? And from that, I encourage them to move backwards. And so if you're developing an education effort, making sure that it's context specific, it's multifaceted. The example I would use is Glacier. They have a video that they make all trip leaders show. It's available online. They have a downloadable PDF. It's a 7 or 8 page document, backcountry trip planner. They're hitting them early, and they're hitting them often with these education efforts. And I think it's paying off in large part with where their visitors are at in terms of these promoted practices. Obviously, both the what, the cognitive, and then the why, the affective component of these, and then finally the ease, as I've spoke to. Someone mentioned earlier, I think Doug, about older travelers, and there definitely seems to be, in my data, particularly from Olympic, and I haven't had the chance to segment it by demographic, the older, more experienced men are more difficult to get to. There is a feeling that I know what I'm doing. And so is it I know what I'm doing? Is it an information saturation problem that we need to begin to paint a little more clear of a picture? And finally, this ethics installation really, at the end of a 3-year doctoral program, seems to be as much about really inches as feet or yards or miles. And so slowly over time, with some targeted education structures, I think we're moving in the right direction. Just a couple of things. We have a technical report. It's on file in our office. That's available as a PDF. I think the folks at Leave No Trace have it as well. It's about 200 pages long. It really teases apart everything that we did. And then the publications, this is, I have the proofs of this if anybody would like it. And then the other ones are all either submitted or about to go as I find time to get to them at work.
So for that demographic of older men that, it's harder to change their minds, who is the best? You talk about the normalization and that, that somebody, like sometimes the icons of the field, the guides or the rangers, whoever might be the best influence. Who seems to be, is it the same level person? Is it another experienced backpacker? Is it people at the pinnacles of that? Is it icons for the climbing industry? I mean, who is it that reaches them for that normalization?
It's the pasta theory is throw it all at the wall and see what sticks. I think you have to work, and so I mean that seriously though. When you have a resistant population, and older men seem to be that in particular. I work with a lot of anglers in Alaska, harvest-oriented anglers, and they're just not very interested in doing things any way different than they did in the past. But guides are sometimes susceptible, and you can influence guides because they need permits, and so you can convince them to change their attitudes. And then when the old man sees the guide doing something different, he might change. So keeping up with the Joneses, social proof, that works. But you've got to try lots of different things. Sometimes you have to try to ramp up the consequences for how bad this will be for your resource if you don't do this. Sometimes you have to try to convince them that they're the problem. You're not in a traffic jam, you are the traffic jam. That's something that people don't understand. And this is all about collective behavior, right? None of us are a single problem. It's a commons problem. It's just that there's too many of us. So we've got to convince them of that, and they've got to convince themselves that they're part of the problem. The phrase there is mutually agreed mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. We got to convince each other to do the right thing, and it kind of doesn't. It takes leaders, and it's hard to find leaders, but you got to try to.
I think for most of us who are part of the Park Service anyway, under the new administration, the new directorship, it's become very clear one of the priorities is to engage non-traditional users into national parks, public lands, etc. And that includes youth, that includes minorities, that includes newly immigrated populations. And I'd be interested in hearing your comments on what the recommendations would be for, okay, if that vision becomes true, a lot of the norms and the standards and the methodology that we've used to try to get people to do things the quote unquote right way in the park may be thrown out the door. So I'd be interested in hearing what your comments on how we would do that in the future.
I'll just make a brief comment, and we had 2 young Latino individuals in our office for the past couple months in DC, and I don't think either one of them had been to like a wilderness or a large landscape park that we often think of. And so I think as we begin to engage new and diverse audiences, it's changing our mental model of what it is we want to introduce them to. And maybe just simply a picnic, just up outside of like El Portal, in the meadow, as opposed to like a 5-day trip into Tuolumne Meadows is a good place to start. And so I think just adjusting a bit of the model that we think of for introducing them into it. And then I think as park managers, we've done a nice job of catering to white Caucasian people like ourselves, and you walk into parks and picnic tables have seating for 6, but when you look at a Latino population who's visiting the area, 6 is maybe just in the first vehicle, and it's oftentimes going to be a much larger group than that. And so finding a way to open the doors and invite them in, and it's I think by just addressing simple barriers like that, which is right within our locus of control to address, is a good starting point.
A lot of those issues are front country. I mean, we see a distinct shift from back country to front country among some of those users. There's also a big demographic hump as the baby boomers age. They're not going in back country quite as often as the past. Maybe when they retire, which they might start to do sometime, they'll come again, but we don't know that for sure. But those are going to be issues, and I think the cool thing about that is that they bring a new set of attitudes and a new set of norms, and you're going to have to deal with those. That you're going to, if they're not working for the kinds of behaviors that are coming with those, and they're causing some impacts, you're going to have to figure out what the consequences that are bad for them. You're going to have to figure out how to convince them that they're part of the problem, and you're going to have to convince them about why it's a good idea, and you might have to use regulations to do that. But if you're forgetting what kinds of things they're going for, the goals that they're trying to reach, you're going to be in trouble that way as well. So you have to know more than just what you want. You have to also know what they want, and that's a critical component, because it's where those two come together. When we got people to use camp stoves, or when we get them to carry out their ash or their poop or whatever else, it's because it works for us and it works for them.
But actually, about the older male population and susceptibility to change, if you reflect back for 20 years or so, when there was accepted practices that we're no longer really seeing anymore, from even burying trash, to some areas, campfires every night was a norm, and now you see less of them. So there is that potential there. And also, I think demographically, it's important to realize that particular demographic is eventually going to evolve out as the demographic of the country changes from, I think it's like 2042 or something, minorities will no longer be the minority. Somebody's figured this out, running out statistics. So, the white Anglo-Saxon male is a endangered species.
I think the historical context is important, and I don't want to lose sight of that. And so what Hawk just spoke to, what was common practice 20 years ago? Cutting pine boughs, large rock rings, at least with the National Park Service. A lot of these practices that were highly impactful on the land, you just aren't seeing them as much. And I feel like our addressing waste management, and this conference is really validating for me, is one of the largest big human issues we have to deal with in backcountry environments. The next big thing will be climate change, but from within the boundaries and the actions that are that people are engaging in, I think human use or human waste is the last big one, at least in my mind.
I just add to that, the generational thing is critical for outdoor recreation. You learn what you learn sometimes from your parents when you're brought out young. And, we've got this whole child in the woods issue that's become a big major issue for a lot of folks. Those are people that aren't going out with their parents. They're not learning from anybody, so we actually have an opportunity to teach them the right stuff from someone else, because their parents aren't bringing them out there. You got to get them out there, and you got to appeal to their limited attention spans. That they've got to have stimuli in order to get out there. But I think it's pretty stimulating once you get them out there. I don't know. Some of us have kids, and they're fine when they're in a modern environment. They do one thing, but if you get them out there, they're fine with sticks and stones and water and rocks and whatever.
So I work at Grand Canyon, and we kind of have maybe a good case study for a change in a norm as far as what we're asking people to do right now. We kind of have a pilot study where we're asking people to actually pack out their poo from a pretty distinct area that's had a lot of impact called Red Canyon, where there's really narrow confined drainage and a real potential for people just basically using the beach as a big kitty litter spot. And first of all, I think that in some ways I kind of find myself a little bit like the grumpy old man and not entirely convinced myself that it's the right idea on one hand, but then on the other, maybe you guys could speak to how you can get a grumpy guy like me that I'm not sure I'm entirely behind it. Maybe it's not the right thing. I don't know. But maybe just talk about how you could potentially get a grumpy person like me to get behind an issue like that.
I just convince you to be a river runner, and then you could carry it out.
Well, I'd do that.
I'm with you. I find it hard to believe that I haven't backpacked very strenuously in a lot of years because I got into river running. But I think it's going to be a challenge to convince people to carry out a week's worth of waste in their backpacks. And so I think that's going to be a challenge. It may not be something that we can convince people to do. I don't know. It might be heavy.
I got one. A lot of the discussion, some things I saw up there involved the trailhead is too late and we can require them to watch videos. But for a lot of us in the other agencies, we don't have control of the access point. So people are just sort of showing up. So how can we be, which part of this should we focus on if we want, the best bang for our buck on trailheads?
I believe the internet is your best resource, and I would encourage you to go on the Glaciers page and download their backcountry trip planner. And I don't know, I think it's invaluable for planning a trip in the high country of Glacier National Park. And a part of it too is the people that are visiting Glacier that I sampled aren't just in Glacier, they're also in other Forest Service and BLM wilderness areas, and that's true for the Olympic visitors as well. And so there's going to be some carryover, but I think relatively inexpensive are these guides to being better stewards and advancing that. I just see that as relatively low-hanging fruit that we're maybe not maximizing as well as we could.
I'd be even more sneaky. I'd be on message boards with fake personas trying to convince people that this is a really cool idea and it's changed things. I'd ramp up the AC and the AR as much as I could in as many ways as I could. I'd try to convince young kids I'd go into high schools and I'd go into REIs and places like that. And I would say probably most of the things you do on your official website are make you feel good, but probably don't do as much for you as some of these other things could do for you. And help get your allies at Ellen, Leave No Trace and whatever. Sorry, I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. But that kind of stuff is going to be more, it's sneakier. It's that influence stuff. It's how people sell you cars and dishwashers and stuff that you don't need. But they do need this, so don't feel guilty about it. It's okay.
It just seems to me, too, that it's important. There's a lot of urgent messages that need to go out today, and it seems like the more we can integrate them and interrelate them, like climate change, sustainability, and I'm thinking of like Ken Cordell's survey that he's done consistently about what people value about wilderness, and people in a general sense kind of get some of the big picture stuff of watersheds, air quality, and some of those things. And I think, I don't know, is it helpful to connect some of these things rather than just be barraged these messages about, this disparate stuff?
I'm always concerned that we load people with too much. And to be truthful, one of my concerns with the Leave No Trace principles is they're currently scripted is there's 7 of them. And I think I suffer from like self-induced ADD. It's almost too much for me. And I wrote a whole PhD dissertation on it. And so the thought of bringing even more in is a little bit concerning if we're addressing specific behaviors on the ground that we want to address. If it's a human waste issue or campfire or invasive species or weeds, whatever it is. So I don't want to discount it because I think there's certainly value, and I just worry that there's so much we need to convey to visitors before they enter these environments that continuing to add to that bucket might just be a little too much for them. And I don't know, that's just my gut reaction.
No, I'm with him on that. And you just mentioned about 5 things that were all at the general attitude level. I don't think there's even much disagreement on most of those big issues, climate change being the one that's not true. But we agree on the big stuff. We agree something needs to be done. But we got to get people to change their behavior. That's way up the hierarchy and much more detailed and specific. You see what he measured was very specific attitudes towards very specific behaviors. When we move away from the specific, we find very low, weak correlations between those things and what people actually do. I mean, I can measure with animals that people love them, they want to protect them, they want to do all this stuff, but they're willing to go kill them in some cases, and then they're not willing to stop some behavior that would help their habitat or something. So you've got to be at the specific level. Convince them about the specific things they're doing. I think most of the social science would say, go more specific. If it's way up at that values level, it's not making much difference in what they're actually doing.
I'm also from Grand Canyon, and Dean kind of touched on that we have this heinous perceived difficulty issue because we're asking people to go uphill 5,000 feet with their poop, and so that's part of our problem. And you touched on in your slideshow about the message and the benefit of the individual contact with the ranger, with the guide, with somebody who's willing to talk to these folks about it. So whether it's right now or it's during a break or whatever, I would love to hear from the field staff of these places that have implemented, like Roger has in these places where you guys have recently or in the last decade implemented carry-out programs. What are you saying as a field ranger to the person on the trail when you're chatting with them, trying to educate them? What kind of hooks are you using? Because those are the kind of things, everybody develops a spiel, and I'm curious what you guys are using.
One clincher that worked early on was we created this thing called the Pro Pin, and people that did cool things. And what the first years we thought was cool was to anybody packing the cans would get Pro Pins, and they were each year we'd create a new design, and they were all around. We decided to base it on a different mountain every year or a theme, but they were all different. And boy, once they got going, everyone wanted one, and so they were going way out of their way to get a Pro Pin, and that, they cost $1 a piece, but it was an incredibly good deal to have, and a simple buy-in that way, and that could work possibly down there.
The idea of giving them a pin, a little tiny reward, a trivial reward, buys in, big deal. That's that reciprocity principle. And then the idea of getting them to commit, saying the words, "I will do this," just once. Then they can't go back on their word. And it means more to them than you think. It's a very powerful, sneaky way to get people to do stuff. That's why that car dealer is always trying to get you to say, "Yeah, I really like the car." Once you said that, you're almost buying it.
Well, at the time that Roger was rolling out the CMCs, I was at American Alpine Club. We were also giving a lot of attention to the fact that we really needed to be supportive of this. I believe the Access Fund was also jumping in. So it's also, how are you working with the volunteer or clubs or other groups that are out there that can echo the message that that the land managers are putting forward. So it's one thing if Roger was trying to do this and the climbing groups were saying, "This is stupid, this is crazy, no one's going to do it." But when all of these other groups are saying, "Hey, I know this is a change in behavior, but we think this is the end result is worth it," probably makes it a lot easier to sell.